a funny hat with a clock on it. Many of you have spoken with me or Martin about how time feels like it's passing in strange and different ways these days. He mentioned it last Sunday in his sermon, and I know I've been experiencing it too. We can certainly lament this change, but I think it's also good to find a little bit of humor in it. So I offer you just a few lines from a longer piece written by a guy named Eli Grober, who writes as if he were the head scientist at the headquarters of time when he says, "Here at Time, we've made a few changes you may already be experiencing that we think you should know about. A minute used to be 60 seconds long. We thought this could be spiced up. A minute can now either be 1 hour or it can take 3.5 seconds. We hope you enjoy this new feature. A day, you may remember, used to take place over the course of 24 hours. We felt this was too much. A day is now over the moment you first ask yourself, what time is it? It does not matter what time it actually is when you do this. As soon as you ask or think, what time is it? For the first time that day, even if it's still 10 in the morning, it will suddenly be 8 at night. Does that make sense? Anyway, you get the idea. He goes on to offer new definitions for a week, a weekend, a month, and even a year. But I bring it up to assure you that the stresses and strangeness that you are experiencing, whether about the passage of time or doing once simple things like errands or trying to figure out how to get away for vacation without leaving your house, let alone your town, these adjustments are real and somehow tiring. When such an ordinary thing like the passing of time feels somehow different and discombobulating, it's difficult to figure out. Ordinary things in the context of such an extraordinary period can get a person pretty deep into the weeds of some existential questions rather quickly. Is time moving in a different way? Or is it really just our experience of it? But what if we're doing many of the same things? Why do we experience doing them differently? I think we exist in a new kind of time, a time in between before and after. We're in the middle of something we can't yet see the end of. Things are changing, but we don't know to what extent, nor can we plan for very much of anything. We're in the middle of some kind of transformation, and transformation is never simple or easy, even if what lies ahead for us has the potential to be something even better than what used to be. The only way forward is right through the messy middle, trusting that we will get through it, calling on all our personal, emotional, and spiritual resources, most especially on our faith. But even drawing on all those good resources, it takes more energy, more effort, and more reflection than anything most of us have ever done. So it's not a wonder that we're feeling tired. The letter to the Hebrews reminds us that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. I know some of you out there have already had times in your lives when you've had to rely on that very definition of faith, when you had no other choice but to trust in what would come, no matter what it would look like. The Message translation of those two short verses from Hebrews is worth reading. It says, "The fundamental fact of existence is that this trust in God, this faith, is a firm foundation under everything that makes life worth living. It's our handle on what we can't see. The act of faith is what distinguished our ancestors, set them above the crowd." What I like about Peterson's translation of this text is that it sets faith in context. It connects us to our spiritual ancestors. It reminds us of our standing invitation into the family of things, which is the sermon title today, taken from a phrase written by the poet Mary Oliver. We are part of the faith that brought our ancestors through the middle of other difficult periods in history and into the time after, having relied on God and on each other during the transformation. I know that a few of you receive Richard Rohr's daily meditations from the Center for Action and Contemplation, and so perhaps some of you saw the entry at the end of April by Cheryl Fullerton, who talked about what it's like when we find ourselves in a liminal space, a space on the threshold of something, a space where transformation is at hand. She suggests that whether we are pushed there or we jump there, we are not where or what we were before, nor do we know how or where we will land in our new reality. Generally speaking, liminal spaces are uncomfortable, yet they are also a place and a state of creativity, of construction and destruction, choice and transformation. In liminal spaces, we are led to draw on resources and possibilities we may never have tapped before. And I don't know about you, but that sounds actually kind of promising and inspiring to me. I've had the good fortune to have participated in a weekly Zoom call with 8 or 10 friends from high school every Saturday for the last 4 months, Saturday evenings. We live all over the world, in Germany, in South Korea, recently by way of Japan, and in 3 time zones here in the US, including Seattle, Phoenix, Chicago, and Boston. And so it's been fascinating to hear firsthand accounts from my friends from wherever they are in the world. We're experiencing this one thing, this virus, this pandemic, and its effects on all of us, but in many different ways. I trust that all of you have made similar observations, but I make it plain here because I think it's part of our particular challenge, including the practice of our faith right now. Sorting through these differences, needing to make choices based on our own comfort level, but also for the good of everyone, not just ourselves, is a real opportunity to come together. So despite what you may hear in the sound bites and the headlines, I ask you to consider those promising and inspiring moments when you see people working together for the good of everyone. Richard Rohr says that more often transformation happens not when something new begins, but when something old falls apart. I think we're in that place. I think we're collectively ready to let go of some old things and embrace some new ones. I think our perspective is shifting from something small to something much larger. I'd like to share with you an ancient Hindu teaching story, which I found in the Book of Awakening by Mark Nepo, which is a daily reader. And the story goes like this. An aging Hindu master grew tired of his apprentice complaining, and so one morning he sent him for a cup of salt. When the apprentice returned, the master instructed the unhappy young man to put a handful of salt into a glass of water and then to drink it. "How does it taste?" the master asked. "Bitter," spit the apprentice. The master chuckled and then asked the young man to take another handful of salt and put it into the lake. The two walked in silence to the nearby lake, and once the apprentice swirled the handful of salt into the water, the old man said, "Now, drink from the lake." As the water dripped down the young man's chin, the master asked, "How does it taste?" "Fresh," remarked the apprentice. "Do you taste the salt?" asked the master. "No," said the young man. At this, the master sat beside this serious young man who so reminded him of himself and took his hands, offering, "The pain of life is pure salt, no more, no less." The amount of pain in life remains the same, exactly the same. But the amount of bitterness we taste depends on the container we put the pain in. So when you are in pain, the only thing you can do is to enlarge your sense of things. Stop being a glass, become a lake. Enlarging your sense of things right now might feel uncomfortable when your thoughts and actions tend towards self-preservation, or at least when we're limiting our activity to a small and very familiar physical sphere. Enlarging your sense of things right now might require you to physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually move to a different place, a place you may not want to go. And yet, I think that understanding where each of our lives fit into the larger picture, into the family of things, is critically important to our collective health and well-being. We are transforming from a glass into a lake. So you might call on an old friend whom you haven't spoken to in a long time just to see how they've been faring and to share honestly how you've been faring too. You might even do that when you feel like it's the last thing you want to do. You might carefully venture out on one trip to one place you haven't been to in 4 months, or even try a new place you've never been to before. You might read a new book, say one from a genre you may not have chosen in the past, like one I chose, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, for example. You might have a conversation with God and consider a new spiritual practice. You might start something new today, which will change your perspective and therefore the direction of your life forever. Last week, I had some vacation time and I took my kayak, which has been sitting in the top of the shoe shed behind the Parson Capen house since I arrived in Topsfield, and I took it out onto both Hood Pond and Chavaku Lake. I got a new life jacket and everything, and while I cannot say that I enacted that ancient Hindu teaching word for word, there was something illuminating about laying my paddle across my kayak in the middle of the lake to pause for a drink of water from my water bottle and to look out onto the vastness of even those relatively small bodies of water and be reminded of this lesson about enlarging my sense of things, about considering the context of my own life in the family of things. The ordinary and the extraordinary might feel like they're getting all mixed up together in some great big bowl of spaghetti right now. Certainly, this is what I find when I open the newspaper and see articles about people grieving loved ones who died without family near them in hospitals or nursing homes, right next to simple new recipes for sourdough bread. And yet, these are all the parts of life: sickness, dying, eating, sleeping, working, and playing. Everything has its time and place, and so do all the things we experience. We are, all of us, woven together with the ordinary bits pushed right up against some of the extraordinary ones, the mundane juxtaposed with the shocking. In the short reading from Exodus this morning, Moses is hemming and hawing with God about what he is sure he can and cannot do. Temporarily overcome with fear at the prospect of what God has in store for him and the Israelites, he attempts to justify his inaction or inability to respond to God's call. Frustrated, God says, "What is that in your hand?" Now, don't misunderstand me here. I'm not suggesting that you too will head out and start performing miracles like Moses, whether it's changing your staff or your kayak paddle, as the case may be, into a snake, or your lawnmower into a desalinization machine. But I do believe that the things and people you touch every day, those ordinary objects and interactions, will be the very things that transform your life. Changing our perspective, widening our view, enlarging our sense of things is the only way out of the painful places we find ourselves, whether it's in the middle of a pandemic, in a deep well of sadness after a death, the end of a relationship or a job, or it's just the temporary divot of one bad day. There are actually two poems you'll hear today before the end of the service. Judy read the first one as we began, and the second one will come as a benediction of sorts, just in a few moments at the end of the sermon. The first poem by Lynn Unger also speaks to the ways we can change our perspective and widen our understanding of where we find ourselves. What if we looked at this time like a great Sabbath? She reminds us that these times can be both terrifying and beautiful places, our lives resting in one another's hands, if not literally so, though we can still reach out with open hearts, kind words, and tendrils of compassion. I hope my short words have helped you consider your place in the family of things. The realization that you too are among so many millions of people in this country and the billions of people in the world who are being called, like geese in the sky, harsh and exciting, to use your imagination in response to God's invitation. As members of this church and children of God, we are committed to one another, you and me, the new people we welcome here. We gather together to remember all the ways that God has already connected us, is connecting us now, and will connect us in the future. We gather to remind one another that God is in the most ordinary of moments, even as God is in the extraordinary ones too. We will continue to share our stories with one another as we continue to listen to the stories of our ancestors too. And even though we have a tendency to do just about anything to keep old things from falling apart, somewhere inside us we know that transformation is at hand. And so we'll rely on faith, on God, and on each other to find the patience, support, and grace to let go, to loosen our grip instead of tightening it, to open our minds instead of closing them, and to widen our welcome instead of narrowing it. The road ahead may be uncertain, friends, but we can walk it together. Amen.